Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today, we're talking about a somewhat mundane but extremely relevant topic. My name is Daniel Chilcott. I'm Managing Director at Flowgear, and I'm joined today by Terence Meyering, who is one of our software engineers responsible for the connectors team. So what we're talking about today is ways that you can automate document integration in your business using Flowgear. And particularly what we're talking about is automation around PDF documents. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need to be using PDF documents. You would have an API and your suppliers and your customers would call your API and send you the data in exactly the form that it needed to exist, but that is not reality, as I'm sure you're aware. So a lot of the time that we find that our customers are receiving orders over emails, over FTP servers, and typically those, if they're not spreadsheets, they're typically going to be PDF documents. So kind of the earlier generation of solutions that would help you process this sort of thing relied on extracting the text from the document and laying out in text form more or less how the actual PDF looked, but it would be subject to variations in offsets. If it was scaled slightly differently when it was rendered, then the offset of a text column would be slightly different. And so a lot of the earlier attempts around this problem required you to have an algorithm that would kind of pick up the start and the end of a phrase. So if you're looking at like an order, it would have to figure out that column, X to Y is the product description, and then immediately after that is the quantity, and then immediately after that is the unit price, and so on. Those solutions, while they do work at scale if the template is completely stable, they're extremely onerous to build. Anytime your customer or your supplier changes the template, you kind of start all over again. And so not very cost effective to get in place. And really what this all derives from is the fact that PDFs are not really designed for machines to read. They're intended to be human layouts, but such is the reality. And so what we want to talk to you about today are two different options that we have available for parsing these documents. And to fit this into context, what we're going to talk about mainly is how we interpret the content of a document into a structured format. We're going to use JSON as that format where we've got stable and clear identifiers for the field. So the field, if it's a quantity field, it'll always be called quantity. And once we've got that stable structure, we're able to map that through into your target system. Perhaps it's your ERP that you're integrating into, and we'll have some demo around that today. So the first one that I want to show you is based on Azure's AI Document Intelligence, or Azure AI DI. This is a slightly more traditional route. It's good for cases where you have a very high volume of documents, but as we'll see, there is some setup cost to it. And then the second option that we'll be looking at is the OpenAI-based document parser that we've built, where what we're doing is trading off the amount of setup time, and you'll have a slightly higher cost to run those integrations, but no setup time. So let me unpack these in a little bit more detail, and then we'll get straight into a demo. So going back to option one, Azure AI Document Intelligence, what this is going to require you to do in the Azure portal is go through this labeling process. So the screen that you see here is an example of a document that's been labeled. It will automatically identify the fields. It'll show different colors to show that this is part of the same type of field. And then you'll kind of click through that and annotate what each of those fields are. In other words, what field name do you want to ascribe to each of the components that it's identified in the document. This is a little bit onerous. You have to do 2 to 3 variations of the same template as sort of a one-time exercise. It's reasonably good at being resilient to some very small changes in the document. So if the like render scale changes slightly or 1 or 2 fields move, it's normally okay with that. But anything more significant than that usually requires some kind of relabel effort. And crucially, what it's going to give you is a document in JSON form, but it doesn't necessarily give you a good way to validate that it's been able to interpret that data correctly. Which brings me to the second option. This is a second connector that we make available. What we're aiming to do here is we see a lot of businesses that don't necessarily have thousands or tens of thousands of the same document that they need to read each month. Instead, what they have is hundreds of customers with tens to hundreds of the same document that they're receiving from each of those customers. And in those cases, the labeling solution just isn't practical because of the amount of time that you'd have to take to label each individual template. So what this aims to do is give you something that's a much lower kind of effort to set up. It produces a schema, that is to say that we produce a specification of the content of the document. For example, the schema will show that there's a field called customer and it's an alphanumeric value because it's the customer code. And then there's a document line section, and within each line is a stock code and a quantity. And, the stock code is alphanumeric, but the stock code is numeric and so on. So the schema describes the shape of that document. You go through a one-step process to define that shape. And then in your Flowgear integration, you'll be able to give it that shape, that schema, and say, now parse these documents from this source using that schema, and it will reliably map onto the schema that you defined as a one-time exercise. So it's a fraction of the effort of the labeling process. And then the other thing that we've done is looked at a way that we can validate particularly the numeric data, its integrity in the document that we scanned or parsed. So for example, if you, again, consider a sales order, you have a quantity, you have a unit price, you have a line price. What the validation will do, and Terence will show you this, is calculate a formula, for example, that says, well, quantity times unit price should match the line price. Otherwise, we've misread something. So it'll run that validation for each line, and then it'll sum up the lines to check that that matches the total, and validate the tax calculation and so on. And the important thing is that we don't build those validations by hand. We're actually enabling AI to create those validations. So for each document type that you need to validate, it's building the validation script for you. And the result of that is, if the validations pass, you can have a very high level of certainty that the document's being correctly parsed. And that's a really important thing when you're dealing with this type of data. It's better to not import it than to import a document that can't be trusted. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Terence, and he's going to walk us through the two options that we've shown over there. Over to you, Terence.
Thank you so much, Dan. So as Dan said, we're going to start with let's just get Teams out of the way. We're going to start with the Azure Document Intelligence model. So I'm going to repeat a bit of what Dan said, but I'd like to do a practical demonstration as we go. So in order to train a model about the document that you'll be parsing, you will import it into your Azure DI environment, and you can run the layout, and you'll get a network error. Lovely.
So what we're looking at here is the first solution, and DI is document intelligence. That's that screen that you see open there. So this is the labeling process.
Yeah. I was really hoping this would work, but let's move on. Maybe I can come back to that in a bit. So yeah, we've implemented the document intelligence reader. You can see it over there, and it will be parsing this document. It's a very basic example of we're taking proposals and we're converting them into opportunities into Salesforce. So how this would work is we will dump a bunch of proposals that have been completed into a file. This can be an FTP server. At the moment, it's just my computer. And it will run through each of them, read them in, convert them using the Azure's DI PDF reader that we've wrapped. And then we need to map it accordingly to take it from a PDF to Salesforce. So we use our quick map node for this, and we introduce some mapping. So you can see here some of the examples of the data that we would see. So every field that we named will pop up here, and we'll have the content. So you can see Fonsley Nova Core pops up over there, and a confidence rating. So 0.966, that is 96.6% confident that this value is correct. It can run across multiple pages and pull in the data. So we've labeled the order number, as well as the project start date, the hours for the project, as well as the total. The idea, or how the Azure works, is you can do full paragraphs, you can do tables, as well as single values out of tables. So what that means is, like everything's not running this. So do I need to refresh my screen now? Oh, log me out. Apologies, everyone. So we would be able to pull out specific values and assign them to things. So I've pulled out the project start date as the date that the proposal needs to close. Yeah, you can see it's running now.
Just
Finally.
before we go into that, though, can we go back to the labeling screen? Because we missed a little bit of content there. Hopefully that's loaded up.
Still not happy.
Okay.
So
do we have one that's already labeled that we can show here?
Yeah. What it would look like, the labeling process live, is you'd have values and you can assign them to whatever name you would like. So we can run through a simple value as a name. We can say that this is a title, who the client is, and I've clicked here, who the client is. And then also, like I said, we can go to the second page and we can define full paragraphs that get pulled in, as well as summaries or values out of table, or the entirety of the table itself, if that is what you require. So if we head back now, we've gone and pulled PDFs, read them into Azure, mapped them, and uploaded them straight into Salesforce. Because these succeeded in Salesforce, they then got moved out to a separate folder. And if we go over to Salesforce, we can see now our two new opportunities. There's Fonsley NovaCore. Now the one will pop through a bit later. So this is the Azure DI PDF reader. As Dan said, it is made for high volume. The setup process is a bit tedious, but once you've got it set up and your documents are very stable, it does work quite well for reading in files. And Dan, is there anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, if you do have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A. We'll run through any that come up towards the end. I think the only other thing I wanted to mention is just for some context for folks who aren't familiar with Flowgear. I think the key thing to mention here around the PDF parse node is that it's producing a document in a form that we can map. So you saw a little earlier the JSON document that's being emitted. So we take that PDF proposal document, we convert it into a JSON, and then the magic is really happening in that quick map tool, which is where the data mappings are taking place. So that's where we're able to translate it into the shape that's required for your ERP, so or in this case, your CRM. So generalizing this, what's going to happen is for each unique template that you have from your customer or your supplier, you're going to create a small workflow like the one that we've shown you. And that workflow is going to end with a mapping step that adjusts the shape of the content that's been read into the form required for your target system. Maybe it's Sage Intacct or it's SAP S/4HANA, for example. Doesn't matter what it is. The point is that you'll create a lightweight workflow for each one of those variations. And depending on the architecture that you choose, as you see in the example that we've presented here, this one is reading data from a file system or a PDF. You could also have a workflow that is waiting for emails to arrive, and you could filter that by a subject or by a specific folder that they get routed to, for example. But the point is that each of those unique templates, you're going to have that read step and then the map step to go and generate the document in its final form, typically the ERP. So recapping, option one, Azure Data Intelligence, Azure DI, requires labeling, good for cases where you have a very large volume of documents for each template. So low number of templates, but a high number of documents.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, from there, I'd like to just do a little backstep to Azure because it is not impossible to use this for our next example for invoices. We can use it for any kind of document. Again, it is just a longer process. So this is what the invoices look like that we will be passing through our OpenAI node. I'll pull them here up on the side. So let's close ops. We can open invoices. So here's our first example. And to show how easy the process is, I will be building out the entire integration for basically the labeling process. So we require our OpenAI document node. And we require two because we will be generating a schema as well as a validation script. We'll be passing the content into both the schema and the validation. So we drop down selection here. And then we also need a name, very important. It's got to have the document name and the content. So we will take the schema that we generate in the first step and we will pass it through and then use the schema to also create the validation script. This is to ensure we're not missing any values and we're not relying solely on what's in the document to generate these values.
So in this scenario, still a setup process, but it should be a much quicker process. And this is essentially a temporary workflow that's just needed the first time you want to work with a novel kind of template. You probably want to actually store this workflow because if your customer changes their template, if it's very extensive, you might want to rerun this, but there's no kind of manual labeling. We're using ChatGPT to pick out all of the fields and automatically identify tables in the document and so on. And just recapping the two steps going on here. So remember, we talked about this earlier. First of all, we need to derive a schema for the document. So we say, given this PDF, what are the list of fields and the hierarchies of that fields and those fields and their data types? So that's the schema step. That's why we've got the first OpenAI doc parser there. And then the second one is generating a custom validation script that figures out what logic we should use to validate the numerical accuracy of the data. So, the example I gave earlier, quantity multiplied by unit price equals line price, but it will run, 50 or 60 different tests depending on how detailed the document is.
Yeah, and as said, this is the schema, which is basically our template. So this is what the values will look like. This is the values that the OpenAI document node will try to fill in from the invoice itself that gets sent through. So from this step, we would take the schema that we generated as well as the script, and we would copy that across to a full workflow. Now, I've already built this in advance because I don't trust myself to do that live, but the process that we're following here is we've got the schema, and we've got the validation script, and they will run, and then the OpenAI will try to complete the values from the invoice and populate each one of the values. It will then use the validation script to ensure that the values are there, and then that the values are correct. So something like quantity times unit price, does that equal line total? Or if we sum all the line totals, does that equal the subtotal? Examples like that. So here you can see we've taken a PDF, read it in, converted it. It found all the different values, the salesperson, the terms, who the customer was, total and subtotal, everything was there. And it created it in Sage without any issues. I'm just going to quickly show the mapping stage. So we take the PDF in its JSON format, and we pass it into what is expected by Sage in this case. And we pass the values through, and we map anything that is required. And we then have it available on Sage. I've added a, 1 second, and it's kicked me out. I've added a line here. So yeah, we can see the new invoice that came through. It's 510. This one. So this is great, but this was the document we trained it on in the schema step. So we'd be very worried if it wasn't able to get this one right. So let's make a change. We're going to move over to the next invoice, which has a small change. It is just a case of the label is no longer at the top and it is slightly shifted over to the left. But we all know how easy this happens. One person will export a PDF while the other one prints or saves as PDF. And small variations like that can cause issues if you're trying to create a vector style that reads position in order to determine what the next value is or where the values lie. So whereas this system is more robust because we've created a schema and we're trying to populate that schema with the values seen. So this does take a little bit longer than the Azure node, but we are also validating all the values as we go along. We've successfully created it. And that's where the power lies in the OpenAI node. But also, if we make a mistake. So I've been guilty of this many times. I will update a invoice, I'll make changes, but I'll forget to include all the added lines to my total. So we can see our total is quite a long ways away from what we're expecting. And this normally, it gets passed through on if we don't have any validation in place. But yeah, we've already got an error saying your expected total was meant to be over 6,000, but we only got 600. So it rejects it. This can then notify the salesperson to update their invoice and send it through the system again. And now we're basically just going to show off because I've spoken about taking a small change like removing a value. But what happens when you rebrand your entire invoice? The great thing about how this node works is it looks for values as if a human would. It would read through all the different values. And because of that, it knows that this is a subtotal, even though it's not in the same position. It knows that it should still look for a salesperson, it should still find payment terms, all of these values. And as you can see, it's successfully created on Sage. And let's head over to Sage and just see all the invoices that we process while in the webinar. And there's the 3 that we see. And that actually went a lot quicker than I expected. That's the node in a nutshell.
Great. You want to flip us over there to the presentation again? So a couple of points to leave you with. These 2 connectors are available in the platform for everyone today. So the Azure DI or Azure Document Intelligence PDF Reader is the first one that we showed you, and then the OpenAI Document Parser is the second. I will also mention that the Doc Parser, although we focused on PDF, it does actually work with other doc types as well. So if you've got images, for example, it will be able to work with those. But I think the key thing around the second option is that it's extremely resilient, first of all, to things like layout changes, like you saw, which if you've tried this type of automation before is a real problem. And secondly, has the ability to detect whether it's accurately internalized the document, because you don't want to proceed with the automation if the numeric data has not been captured accurately. So that's what I dealt with. I got a question here. Is this available to us on existing Flowgear packages? Absolutely. So there's no restriction on these connectors. We're taking a view on this that we're not doing our own kind of pay-per-use pricing on it. So you will have a direct account with Azure in the case of using the first node, and for the second, you'll have a ChatGPT account. If you go over to help.flowgear.net and search for these connectors, you'll be able to access obviously the help articles for each of these. And then importantly, we've also documented out the setup steps. So if you haven't worked with OpenAPI before, you go to platform.openapi.com. We'll walk you through the steps to go about setting up an account there. And you can do things like, how you want the charges to be applied and, what your top-up frequency should be and what your minimum threshold is. So we kind of walk you through all of that stuff.
And be sure to top that up before doing a webinar.
We have been hit with that problem before. All right, another question here. Will it handle one file with multiple pages of invoices from different vendors? That's an interesting one. I don't think we'd really considered multiple separate vendors. Certainly multi-page documents would be fine. I think we would probably prefer to split them out into different documents. But if you do have a case where there's some legitimate reason that you've received a bunch of different documents munged into one PDF, we could look at that. I guess if each document was fairly easy to see the start and end of, like each one was one page, or it was very easy that a different letterhead was starting, and the fields are similar enough, you could probably still get away with one schema, but I wouldn't want to make a commitment on that without having a look at it first. So if you want to share with us, we'd be happy to evaluate that for you. Question here, is there a how-to we can use as per the demo? So again, if you just search for the help articles or you go into a workflow, drop these nodes on, click the context menu and click on the help option, it'll deep link you straight into the article. And in addition to the setup steps for working with Azure or OpenAI, we also have links to shared workflows that you can just open up and import them directly into your account. So you've got reference workflows for that. And the GPT account that we use, it's your own customer account. If you do need some help with this, we'd be happy to help you out. We just didn't, at this point, think it was good for us to get involved in kind of trying to on-bill your pay-per-use charges. We want our customers to have freedom around how that gets set up. So we're not using our accounts. You have total control over the use of your own account. If you have multiple PDFs in a folder that have different structures, how would the flow handle that? Because there would potentially be different schemas and validation rules. I think the assumption that we're operating on is that you would know the origin of the document. So, for example, if they're arriving via email, you've probably got different senders, and that you would use to signal which parser configuration to use. Or, for example, if your customers are transacting with you over FTP, you might give each customer a separate folder to access, and so the folder signals. There are ways to deal with it if they're all mixed into one, but it would be preferable that you knew that out the gate. Does the parser provide confidence levels for extracted fields? And if so, how do you recommend handling low confidence results in a workflow? Azure DI's approach is a confidence value per field. Honestly, a production document may have 50 or 100 fields, so it's fairly inconvenient to manually assert certainty on individual fields. Probably what you would want to do is use QuickMap to just get the min of all of the confidence levels of all the fields you're interested in, and if it's below a threshold, just decide not to do it. That's probably the best. With the second option under OpenAI doc parse, I wouldn't really, there's kind of no half and half, right? Either you create the order or you don't. It's not usually worthwhile trying to half create the order. But I think what you will find is that the validation is a fail-safe mechanism, but it's quite rare that the document will fail to parse correctly. So, you should have a 95, 99% success rate. So if you're moving off the happy path, the documents fail to parse, the validation script will catch that as a worst case. It might catch it during parse. If it doesn't catch it there, it'll catch it during the validation script. And at that point, you could trigger an exception for a human to get involved and be able to deal with it. All right, looks like last question. Please confirm that it will work with images like JPEG, and is there a minimum resolution? It will work with rasters. I think we've done some tests with PNGs. Problem with JPEGs is that they are a lossy format, so as long as it's a reasonable quality, it should be okay. Like I mentioned at the start, it's in an ideal world, we'd be doing this over APIs and we wouldn't even have this problem in the first place. So if you can negotiate getting a better way to operate or integrate with your customer or your supplier, that's obviously first prize. If you have a choice between a raster and a PDF, go for a PDF. But yes, it should be able to work with an image as long as the quality is reasonable. I guess one last thing is just to kind of index into what the pricing around this looks like. So super rough numbers, because it does depend on the field density in the documents. But as a very rough ballpark, you could probably budget approximately 1 US cent per page using the Azure DI approach, and then approximately 4 or 5 US cents per page using the ChatGPT approach, so the OpenAI doc parser approach. So there is a trade-off, there is a big cost difference, but unless you're doing tens of thousands of documents, you're talking, 50 or a couple of $100 a month. So it's not really a big number. And the trade-off is that you're saving hours of laborious setup time, but there will certainly be a tipping point. If you've got a high volume of documents and it's, a low number of templates and it's very stable, then the DI approach is more cost effective. And yes, that cost is going to either OpenAI or Azure. So what we're providing is the connectors available out the gate. You're running an independent account with OpenAI for ChatGPT or with Microsoft for the Azure DI side, if that's the route that you've chosen to go. Great. Well, appreciate the interest and the questions there. Thank you very much for joining us. We will put out a recording of this as well. As I mentioned, feel free to read up on the detail of these two connectors and look at the shared workflows on help.flowgear.net. Thank you.